Hi everyone, today I'm going to tell you the one true story. Please support me by liking and subscribing. Thanks, are you ready? Here we go. For as long as Gabriel could remember, there had always been the scream. It was faint at first, like a faraway cry carried by the wind. His earliest memory of it was when he was just a toddler, playing alone in his room. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. A trick of the mind that happens when you're young and unaccustomed to the world around you. The scream was distant, barely audible, as though it came from deep within the earth or the sky. But it was always there. Gabriel didn't tell anyone about it. His parents were busy, working long hours, and when they were home, they were tired and distracted. The scream didn't frighten him. It was just there. He grew used to it like one grows used to the ticking of a clock or the hum of an old refrigerator. Over the years, the scream became a background noise to his life, something he could ignore if he focused hard enough on his toys, his schoolwork, or his friends. As Gabriel entered his teenage years, the scream began to change. It was no longer the soft, distant cry it once was. It grew louder, sharper, more insistent, until it was a low, almost constant hum that followed him wherever he went. The scream no longer felt like something that existed outside him. It was in his bones, reverberating in his chest, and echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind. He asked no one about it. It was just part of him now. The world around him became increasingly chaotic. School was stressful, his friendships were strained, and his home life was fractured. Yet the scream was the only constant. It was there, lurking just beyond the edges of his consciousness. A gnawing presence he could never shake off. Then he met her. Her name was Clara. She was everything he wasn't. Light where he was dark, free where he was bound. When he first saw her, sitting on the park bench reading a book, it felt like the world shifted. The scream, which had been a steady undercurrent for so long, became louder the moment their eyes met. He didn't understand it at first. He just knew that something had changed. Clara became his anchor. He started to fall in love with her little by little. It wasn't just her beauty, but her warmth, her laughter, the way she seemed to make the world a better place just by being in it. But the scream, the one that had always been there, started to change again. It began to scream with such intensity that it rattled his bones. It came at night at the oddest moments, when they walked hand in hand by the lake, when they kissed under the streetlights. It was as though the very act of loving her awakened something deep inside him, something he could not control. The scream grew louder, sharper, and more terrifying. It was as though the world was being ripped apart around him, and the sound was coming from the very core of his being. Gabriel didn't tell Clara. He couldn't. How could he explain something so strange, so terrifying? He was already afraid of losing her. The thought of telling her about the scream felt like admitting he was losing his mind. The scream, once a distant murmur, now felt like it was inside him, clawing at his thoughts, eating at his soul. He could hear it in the middle of conversations, in the quiet moments between them, in the pauses after she laughed. The scream twisted inside him, louder, angrier, sharper. And then, one night, something broke. Gabriel's mother and father had been arguing again, their voices rising in the house as they always did when they were drunk. The noise was unbearable. The scream inside him, the one he could never escape, merged with their shouting, and in that instant, everything seemed to collide. He could hear the echo of the scream in their voices, in the way they yelled at each other. And then he snapped. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, the blade cold and sharp against his fingers. In his mind, there was no choice. The scream had always been with him, had always been his constant companion. But now it was unbearable, and it was growing. It was loud, deafening. It seemed to be urging him, pushing him toward something. He didn't know what it was, only that he couldn't live with it anymore. The first person he killed was his mother. Her scream was loud, but it couldn't drown out the one that filled his head. He turned on his father next, the blood splattering against the walls as the scream in his mind grew louder, shriller, more desperate. It felt like the house itself was shaking under the weight of the sound, and he couldn't stop. And then there was Clara. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but the scream, The damn scream, it was too much. It filled his head, consumed his thoughts, until all he could see was her, smiling at him, asking him what was wrong. It was in that moment of vulnerability that the scream surged, and before he knew it, Clara was dead too, her beautiful face frozen in terror. Gabriel ran. He ran into the woods, his legs aching, his breath ragged as the scream followed him, relentless, mocking him with every step. The trees were black silhouettes against the moonlit sky, the wind howling through the branches like a mournful song. He stumbled through the darkness, desperate to escape, but the scream was louder now, echoing in every branch, in every rustle of the leaves. It was inside him, outside him, pulling at his mind, twisting it, bending it until he didn't know where he ended and the scream began. He collapsed in the forest, the cold earth beneath him offering no comfort. He tried to sleep, but the scream wouldn't stop. It grew louder, piercing his skull, echoing through every fiber of his being. His chest tightened. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but he couldn't escape. He covered his ears, but it didn't help. The scream was inside him, wrapping around his mind like a vice, squeezing tighter with each passing second. It became unbearable. His thoughts shattered, his mind cracked, and he could no longer distinguish between the world around him and the chaos inside. He was becoming the scream. He could feel it, his very soul disintegrating, merging with the sound. His body was no longer his own. His heart no longer beat in time with the world. The scream was all that existed, and it was him. The world faded. The last thing he heard was his own scream. It tore through the night, a horrible, guttural sound that seemed to go on forever. He died from it, but death didn't bring peace. No, Gabriel did not find rest. Instead, he became the scream. He was the one who screamed, forever trapped in an endless cycle of agony. He was trapped in the pain of dying, over and over, forced to listen to his own cry of terror as it tore through the very fabric of existence. He was no longer human. He was only the scream, and it would never stop. Gabriel's scream echoed through the forest, drowning out the night. His body, still warm, was no more than a vessel, empty, lifeless, its soul ripped apart. But the scream, it lingered. It wasn't a passing thing. It was not the cry of a man in pain, but the howl of something far older, something far darker, that had consumed him entirely. There was no peace in the stillness that followed. No release from the torment. No end. The scream that tore through the air was not just a sound. It was the very essence of Gabriel's soul, twisted and warped into something monstrous. He could no longer separate himself from it. It was him, and it was never, ever going to stop. The world around him became increasingly distant. The trees blurred into darkness. The stars above were little more than distant specks in an endless void. Time, once a comforting rhythm, no longer existed for Gabriel. He was lost in a place where there was no past, no future, only the infinite now. The scream was all that remained, all that mattered. His body was gone, his mind fractured, but his soul had become the scream. As Gabriel's consciousness fractured, a terrible truth began to emerge. He was no longer alive in any meaningful sense. He was bound to the scream, a being of pure sound and fury, stretched across eternity. It had always been inside him, but now it was everything. The agony that had tormented him in life was nothing compared to what it had become in death. There was no release, no escape. There was only the scream, the unyielding, unrelenting sound that carved through the fabric of his existence, like a blade cutting through flesh, over and over. In this new state, Gabriel's fractured consciousness began to recall his last moments, his last actions. He saw his family, their faces frozen in fear, their bodies lying in pools of their own blood. He remembered Clara, her body lying cold and lifeless, the spark of life extinguished with a single, unthinking act. He had loved her. He had loved them all. But now they were gone, and there was nothing left but the endless scream. The worst part wasn't the blood. It wasn't the death. It was the silence. The awful, suffocating silence that had swallowed everything up, leaving him in this nightmarish loop of anguish. He couldn't understand it. How had he gotten here? Why had it come to this? The scream had always been with him, yes, but it had never been like this. It had never been this loud, this all-consuming. It was as though the scream was alive, feeding off his suffering, growing in intensity with each passing second. And with it, his mind began to shatter further. Pieces of his thoughts fragmented, torn apart by the ceaseless, shrieking cry. He could no longer think clearly. He couldn't even remember what peace felt like. His identity, who he was, who he had been, was dissolving into the abyss, piece by piece, until only the scream remained. How long had he been here? Time had become meaningless. Was it days? Weeks? Years? His mind, now unmoored from the constraints of time, couldn't answer. It no longer cared. The only thing left was the scream, reverberating in his mind and his soul louder and louder, until it was all he could hear. And then, the true horror of his fate became clear. He was the scream. He had become it. His soul was nothing more than an echo, a hollow cry that would reverberate through the void for eternity. There was no end, no release. His suffering was endless. His thoughts were gone, replaced by the perpetual, bone-rattling wail that tore through him. He was trapped in it, trapped in the cycle of his own creation. There was no redemption, no salvation. He had killed everyone he loved. He had killed himself. And now, he was condemned to exist as the very thing that had haunted him all his life. The scream. In his last vestiges of sanity, Gabriel's fractured mind screamed out, though it was no longer his own voice, no longer his own thoughts. It was the scream, the thing that had consumed him. He wanted to die, but death had already come and gone. It was no longer an escape. It was the endless present, the eternal torment of his own making. And so Gabriel's soul, what was left of it, was lost forever, trapped in the scream that he could never escape, never silence. The forest around him remained dark, cold and silent, save for the unending cry of a man who had once lived, once loved, but had become nothing more than the echo of his own agony. The scream would never stop, and Gabriel would never, ever rest. Thank you for watching. Please support me and meet me in another video.